Good morning, everybody, dear friends, dear colleague. I am very happy to open this session, Current Issues in Interpreting Studies. It's a small section. Normally we have to have 3 speeches or 3 participants. But the first one, colleague Miroslava Melicherčíková, in the last moment announced that she's very ill. We are very sorry for that, but we understand that in this situation it's quite difficult to contact us also via online possibilities. Miroslava Melicherčíková had prepared very interesting, I suppose, speeches about consecutive and or simultaneous interpreting, an empirical study. And I would like to say that all this session will be empirical. 2 of the presentations will have about training, and the third one will be from the reality, from the real world of interpreting, but it will be also an interpreting study. As I said, colleague Melicherčíková cannot attend this discussion, but if I can very shortly summarize her presentation about training students on consecutive and seeing if the progress in consecutive interpreting will influence their adaptability or the using of simultaneous interpreting, the results are that yes. So it is a real good proof that we have already start in our teaching interpreting program with consecutive interpreting, and only after consecutive add also the training and teaching of simultaneous interpreting. So it is just a short information, and I hope that you will be able to read more in the future about this empirical study, because it was also a part of a big project. And now I would like to introduce our colleague from the University of Szeged, Mária Bakti, and she will speak, I suppose, in English about the shifts of grammatical cohesion and in consecutive interpreted target language text. It will be also an empirical studies with students from English to Hungarian, and she will speak about this experiment. So, Maria, the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much. I hope you can hear me okay. Okay, so I would like to thank you for the introduction, and I would like to thank the organizers for being part of this wonderful conference. I was there in Nitra in 2018, and I enjoyed that conference very much, and I enjoyed this conference too, although it would be, of course, much better to be there with you in person. So what I'm going to speak about is shifts of grammatical cohesion in consecutively interpreted target language texts. And basically here you can see the outline. First I'm going to speak about key concepts, then the method and material I gathered, and then results from 3 viewpoints. The proportion of cohesive devices or cohesive ties that were transferred or kept from the source text, cohesive ties per 100 words of target text, and comparison with students' spontaneous speech, and then there will be a summary. So as an introduction, a couple of words about cohesion, which is seen as a basic aspect of text organization, and it can be achieved through the use of cohesive ties or relations that can be established either by grammatical or by lexical means. And these lexical and grammatical features explicitly signal relationships between text parts. And most of the research comes from English. So most of the research related to cohesion comes from English, but then there are, of course, several approaches. Here you can say Holiday and Hassan's classification of cohesive devices from 1976, whereas Bogrand and Dressler have a broader understanding of cohesion, which is one of their 7 standards of textuality. And most studies on cohesion refer to written texts, whereas Bogrand and Dressler are the first to say that intonation can also be seen as a subsidiary cohesive system in spoken text, because that's what gives the text its audible contours. That's where you know where a sentence, or rather a unit, finishes and the next one starts. And a revised model that I used is based on Holiday and Mathiassen's work, and then is used in Károly Kristina's work on cohesion, where 2 types or 2 means of cohesive ties are differentiated: grammatical means, such as reference, conjunction, substitution, and ellipsis, and lexical means, and these are lexical cohesion, synonymy, hyponymy, repetition, and collocation. So, as I have mentioned, cohesion and studies on cohesion concern mostly English, and of course concern written texts. But I guess many of you have been listening to interpretations these past 2-3 days, and those of you who listen to interpreted target texts have already felt that texts somehow hang together differently after being interpreted. And that was the feeling of Miriam Schlesinger as well, who did the first research on cohesion and shifts of cohesion in simultaneous interpreting. And she followed Bloom-Kuka's work on shifts of cohesion and the explicitation hypothesis. And that was a quote from her. And Schlesinger differentiated between, or she wrote down 3 constraints. One was the time constraint in simultaneous interpreting. The second one, linearity constraint, meaning that interpreters work based on unfinished input. And the third one, the unshared knowledge constraint, that is, interpreters might not be as familiar with the theme, the domain, as the speakers. So according to Schlesinger, these constraints influence the recognition and rendering of cohesive ties by simultaneous interpreters, and these constraints result in mode-specific shifts. And in her results, Schlesinger found shifts across all of the 6 categories of cohesive markers that were identified by Holiday and Hassan. She found no consistent pattern in reference shifts. She found ellipsis was replaced with lexical cohesion. She found a tendency towards omissions in conjunctions. Causal and additive conjunctions were retained, but other types were omitted, together with items that were thought not essential, or low frequency items, or sentence final elements. So this is what she found. However, we have to stress that the nature and distribution of these shifts also depend on the languages concerned and the register of the source text. And here are some research carried out with different language pairs: English, Hebrew, Japanese, and English, Polish. And now I would like to very briefly speak about English to Hungarian, the English to Hungarian language pair. Many researchers have found it very challenging to look at and examine cohesion, because in Hungary, especially for reference, it's very difficult to see how much of the original reference ties is retained or transferred or omitted, because we have in Hungarian 0 pronouns, and personal and possessive pronouns are very often expressed with suffixes. And Heltai and Juhász found that in translation from English into Hungarian, personal pronouns changed to zero pronouns, and the English to Hungarian direction favors implicitation instead of explicitation. So that has an effect on reference and also lexical cohesion. And Claudia and Caro have found that there are differences between novice and expert translators when using lexical cohesive ties. And as for English to Hungarian interpreting, I would just like to refer to two studies that I carried out earlier on the use of cohesive devices or cohesive ties. In the first one, I looked at shifts of cohesion in simultaneous interpreting and translation. Basically, our students were invited to translate and interpret simultaneously the same text, the same source text, and more cohesive devices were added by simultaneous interpreters than by translators. So if you look at cohesive ties per 100 words of the target text, simultaneous interpreters added more cohesive ties. And in another study, I looked at cohesion, grammatical cohesion in consecutively interpreted and sight translated texts, and more cohesive devices were kept from the source text in sight translation, but more cohesive devices were used in the target language in the consecutively interpreted texts. And now let me move on to this particular study that I would like to, the results of which I would like to share with you. What I looked at was consecutively interpreted target language texts, and these were recorded at the end of the second, third, and fourth year of a master's program in interpreting. And my questions were, what would be the proportion of cohesive devices or cohesive ties kept or omitted from the source text, and whether this would change, this proportion would change as students progress in their training. What would be the number of cohesive ties per 100 words in the target text? In other words, how much students would add during translation, and whether this would change as students progress in their training. And also there was a comparison, or there is a comparison with the cohesive ties used in the Hungarian spontaneous speech of the students. And my presuppositions were that in consecutive interpreting, there's no time constraint and no linearity constraint. And because the topics of the source text were familiar to the students, I expect, so there was no constraint related to unshared knowledge. And my presuppositions based on earlier studies in the field were that students will omit more conjunctions than ties related to reference, and they will feel elliptical structures. And I suppose that students will omit less of these ties as they progress in their training. And I also suppose that there would be stronger cohesive ties in the target text than in the source text. So target text will have more cohesive ties than the source text, and there will be more cohesive ties in the text as students progress in their training. And interpreted target texts will have more cohesive ties than the spontaneous speech of the students. And I have already touched upon the methodology, but just a couple of words about that. It was a longitudinal study with not too many participants, and you will see that. And in the course of the study, recordings were made of consecutive interpreting and sight translation of students at the end of the second, third, and fourth semesters of their MA program in translation and interpreting. And also recordings of the students' spontaneous speech were made at the end of the second semester. For consecutive interpreting, they had comparable source language texts on education in the USA and the UK. Recordings were made in a language lab, and then the target texts were transcribed and analyzed using the taxonomy of Károly Krisztina. And here you can see reference markers for personal, demonstrative, and comparative reference, ellipsis, and conjunction. And here you can see a table of the source language texts. Like I said, these were comparable texts about different institutions of higher education in the USA and the UK. And basically, the aim of these presentations was to popularize these institutions of higher education for prospective students. And the participants, what I'm going to look at now is the results of 4 students, 3 female and 1 male. And it's the number of participants on the one hand is very small. Secondly, it's not gender balanced because participation was voluntary in this investigation and was restricted to students who chose the interpreting stream in the training. So at the end of the first year of their MA, they can choose between translation and interpreting, and only few students choose interpreting. Another important factor is that for all of these students, English is their C language, and most of the studies focused on English, participants with English as a B language, and I was curious to see what happens if we work with students whose English is a C language. So let me move on to the results. What I looked at first was the proportion of cohesive devices transferred or kept from the source text. And you can see first the percentage of cohesive ties kept from the original. The first column is the name of the students, and then a proportion of cohesive ties kept from the original after the recording made after the second, third, and fourth semester. And basically, even though the sample size is very small, but not even though the sample size is very small, and there is no consistent pattern in reference shifts that we can observe. And as for the elliptical structures, there were a few elliptical structures in the original, and in the translations, in the interpretations in the target texts, the parts with the elliptical structures were either omitted or elliptical structures were filled, replaced with lexical cohesion. So again, no consistent pattern there. And what we can see in conjunction, the use of conjunction in a proportion of cohesive ties kept from the source text is again a tendency towards omissions in the case of some students. And then if we look at cohesive ties per 100 words of the target text, so basically what happened in the target text, then what we can see is that for reference, so in the first second line, in a brownish shade, you can see cohesive ties per 100 words of the source text, and you can see that in the case of translations or in the case of the target text, in every case there were more cohesive ties per 100 words of text related to reference. So in the second, third, and fourth semesters, you can see that there were more cohesive ties related to reference in the target text. And these were mostly related to demonstratives such as this and that. These were quite frequently used. As concerns elliptical constructions, basically there I could find no consistent pattern, whereas in the case of conjunctions, we can see that so if we compare the number of conjunctions per 100 words of the target text, these always exceed the number of conjunctions in the original. So even though there was a tendency to omit conjunctions, they also very liberally added conjunctions to their target language texts. And finally, a comparison with their spontaneous speech production. So basically, very often consecutive interpreting can be seen as a form of spontaneous speech, because the constraints described by Schlesinger for simultaneous interpreting are not really there in consecutive. Interpreters work based on a finished input. There is some time constraint, but obviously it's not as strong as in simultaneous, and they were familiar with the topic of higher education. So basically, I think that that meant that it would be quite, so the two modes of speaking are quite similar. Obviously, in the case of consecutive interpreting, they worked based on a source text. And here you can see in the second column figures for spontaneous speech. And again, what I did was I calculated the occurrence of cohesive ties for 100 words of text for spontaneous speech, and then for the second, third, and fourth semester target texts. And what we can see for referential ties is that there were more cohesive ties in the consecutively interpreted target texts than in their spontaneous speech production. As concerns elliptical structures, what we can see is there were, in most cases, fewer elliptical ties per 100 words of text in the consecutively interpreted target texts. And as concerns conjunctions, if you look at spontaneous speech and compare it with the consecutively interpreted target text, we can see that there are less conjunctions in the consecutively interpreted texts than in the spontaneous texts of the students. So what would all this tell us? What can we see in summary? First, the proportion of cohesive ties transferred from the source text show no clear tendencies. We can see there were more reference and conjunction ties for 100 words of target text than in the source language text, and fewer elliptic structures in the target text. No detectable change as students progress in their training. And if compared with spontaneous speech, there were more referential ties in the target text than in spontaneous speech, and less elliptical ties and less conjunctions. And basically, what we can see is that these results to some extent reflect the active analysis and restructuring of the source text during consecutive interpreting, in a sense that thinking processes are reflected in the use of reference and connectives. They add a lot of these cohesive ties when they interpret, when they render the target text in consecutive interpreting. And also, interpreted text can also be seen as a form of spontaneous speech with lots of unfinished sentences, repairs, and restarts. And that's why, and this is taking me to the limitations of this research. It's very difficult to analyze these texts because in the target text, it's very difficult to signal sentence or phrase boundaries, and also during interpreting, you break up longer units into shorter units, and also in consecutive, that's also some more difficult because students actively analyze and restructure the source text, unlike during simultaneous interpreting. And I have already referred to the limitations of this research. It's a small sample, but that's what I have to live with, because these were the students who volunteered and who attended the interpreting stream of our training. And the method of analysis I presented is not ideal for such a small sample size. I'm working on a qualitative analysis as well, and also results can be compared with the explicitation shifts in the target text, and also a comparison with other working modes. So the site translated texts of the students still wait to be analyzed. And this brings me to the end of my presentation. I'd like to thank you for your attention. Ďakujem.
Ďakujem, Maria. Thank you very much for your presentation. Thank you very much for your presentation, Maria. It was very, very interesting. And I suppose that we will have many questions in the room, but also via online Slido. Can I ask the first question eventually? First of all, I would like to thank you very much that there was a theoretical part, very interesting, very useful, especially for the students, for example, preparing their diploma thesis and doing also some experiment in this sense. And I appreciate also your case study because I suppose that we can say that it was a small case study. At the end, you wrote that other working modes can also be examined. Do you think to do it also with Simultaneous now? Because I very appreciate that you have done it in consecutive, because you show us some different experiment, but it was mostly done in Simultaneous, if I'm right. Schlesinger and other between
Yes,
English
yes, all of these
Hebrew,
were for
English
simultaneous.
and Japanese and English and Polish.
Polish.
So you will try to do the same, for example, the same speeches in Simultaneous to look if the number of cohesion device or ties will be different or the same?
Thank you very much for your question. That's the plan. However, in Hungary, master's programs are structured in a way that students don't do simultaneous. They can do that, or they do that only in postgraduate courses of interpreting. So first they have to do their masters, and then they can continue their studies in a postgraduate course where they do simultaneous. And that is so to do something like simultaneous, we did the site translation bit, but I haven't yet analyzed the data set. So at our university, we hope to start a postgraduate program where we teach simultaneous interpreting as well in February. So hopefully with that group of students, we can do the same text and see what happens to cohesive devices.
Thank you very much for your answer. Do we have some questions in the room? Yes, Martin, please. Martin Jovčat.
Thank you very much. And Professor Ildiko Horvat has just arrived, so I would just like to let you know. She's one of our panelists. And Maria, I would like to thank you for your presentation. I like listening to your research. I like reading your research. I think that you've been very concise in your work. However, I do have one question. I mean, as Ivana mentioned, small sample size, we would call it a case study, I guess. And I was thinking whether we could expand that. Maybe what results would you expect if the sample's been bigger? And the second question I'd like to ask is, what about comparing online? I know that's a bit modern now, but I believe that is quite important. Whether you think those results would be different in on-site and online interpreting and teaching interpreting. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Martin, for your question, and greetings to Ildiko. Yes, it is a case study, and that's what I prepare it to be, or to publish it as case studies, longitudinal case studies. Actually, I don't really expect major differences with a bigger a bigger sample. Obviously, here there were some cases where there were no no detectable tendencies. There maybe a bigger sample would yield sort of clear tendencies. But what I think what I think would not change is the comparison with the spontaneous speech of the interpreter. So I think that would remain the same. So the proportion of cohesive ties in the spontaneous speech and in consecutively interpreted target texts. And as concerns on the online mode, online teaching and online interpreting, I don't think that would change the results, because maybe there would be more hesitations in online, or I don't know, problems related to technology, and you have to wait and some interpreters might be a bit more nervous because of the online mode, or maybe at the beginning they were more nervous because of possible technical glitches. But as concerns speech production, as concerns active analysis of the source text and then restructuring it, I don't think that would be different in an online setting. So that, based on my own experience and on basically the processes, the thinking processes, active analysis, and then the rendering or speech production, target text production, I don't think it will be different in an online setting.
Thank you very much for the answer. Perhaps one, not question, but perhaps one last comment. It will be very interesting to do a replication between other language combinations, because all the studies that you mentioned are every time done with between English and some language, Hebrew, Japanese, Polish, and now Hungarian. But I think that if you do it in other language combination, perhaps the result of the number of cohesion devices would be different. Do you think to do it with your colleagues at the university between other language combinations, use the same text and speak in, I don't know, Spanish, French, German, and then interpret it consecutive into Hungarian.
Thank you very much for this this comment. Actually, we haven't yet thought about it, but that would be an interesting line of investigation, especially if you have source languages, as you mentioned, other than English, or source languages with a richer morphology. I guess it would be even more interesting to try Slovak into Hungarian if we can find interpreters for that, because with English, like I said, has different tools for achieving reference than Hungarian, so that is a major problem. So maybe we could try and see what happens with other language combinations. So that would be an avenue of future investigation. Thank you.
So once more, thank you very much, Maria, and I hope that you will be with us and listening the second presentation done by Jaroslav Stahl. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
So we will wait the connection with Jaroslav Stahl from Bratislava, from Comenius University. Jaroslav, can we hear you? And can we see your presentation, please? I will just...
Počujete ma?
Áno,
Počujete ma teraz?
počujeme vás, v poriadku.
Dobre, ďakujem veľmi. Thank you very much. I just don't see my presentation, but now I see it. Okay, thank you very much. Fine. So thank you very much for being able to present here at this valuable conference. I was here 3 years ago, but not online. So at least I have this chance to present this very empirical study. Good morning, Mrs. Professor Čeňková. Good morning, all chairing participants. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Well, the impact of interpreter absence, this is a very practical topic. It's certainly not so complex and not that scientifically based as the previous lecture, the previous presentation. It's really based on empirical data, based on an inquiry. But this is I think a very topical issue. When more and more interpreters are often fewer used in various settings, by various clients, by various partners in various circumstances and occasions and assignments. Next slide, maybe. Oh, okay. So as I said, this research is quite limited to a certain area and to a certain geographical area, maybe not geographical, but a certain area of interpreting market. But first we have to transfer ourselves to the client. And before, if you imagine the local market I researched into, but at any market, you first have to ask the question: when do you need an interpreter? Of course, this is no subject of interpreting market. Is there any problem? First, we have to transfer ourselves. Is there any problem understanding me or?
S echem, s ozvěnou, asi si vypněte nějaký mikrofon.
Of course, this is no subject of scientific definition, and translation studies, they deal with other things. They define what is interpreting, studying text corpora, psychology, participants, what goes on in the head of an interpreter, and so on. But if you're a client and even organizer, you need to know something about the participants and the partners. And the first question is whether I need really the interpreter, an interpreter or not. Yes, and this is decisive for us That means for the interpreter, for the market. Next slide. These are the classical questions. Organizers of events have their problems when hiring interpreters. As I said, they really need them. So the organizer has to know the participants or guests. They may understand, but they often overestimate their language level and they have no active proficiency, mainly in case of technical negotiations and so on. They often overestimate themselves, but it's not confined to specific fields, and still it may result into misunderstandings and quite a lot of problems. But once there is no interpreter, of course, the event organizer has to ask himself a question: what language to choose? Of course, yes. And these are this is one of the fundamental questions. The language of guests may be if the guests come from a country which is the language of which is more widely spoken, or shall he choose a language which is foreign to all participants, which is more fair, and everybody can express up to the same level as for his language proficiency, but that may be individual. Next slide. And this is, of course, all these aspects are topical issues for the interpreting market, and the main questions are we placed to each other, to ourselves, or to us within a special inquiry concentrated on a special market segment where first, how does the absence of an interpreter affect the outcome of meeting? This is a question we have to place, we have to ask. The second, but more important, is what are the most frequent solutions if no interpreter is used? And third, how does it affect the interpreters? That means the actors on the market, yes? And for this purpose, we employed market research in a form of a questionnaire. Next slide, please. And this was in a form of an inquiry into the use of interpretation service in Slovakia and Austria. Although in Slovakia, there could have been entities or subjects which could have worked in other working languages, like I don't know, in cooperation with other countries and so on, but that's not so interesting. The research was made in a form of questionnaire using the Survio research tool, which is quite accessible or available on the web. I investigated, I tested, and went through various resources, but I didn't saw any major previous inquiry of that type here. So there may have been some other on other markets, but I don't know about it. Actually, the subjects inquired were possible clients. That means municipalities, that means towns, villages and so on, who may participate in various projects, businesses, companies, but associations, trade unions, whoever. But especially I concentrated into these municipalities and regions which often take part into cross-border cooperation projects where interpreters are being hired for a longer time, for the duration of a project, maybe 3, maybe 5 years, and they some sort become partners and apostrophes. And in this respect, I made 90 requests, and I've received 58 replies in total, but not to all questions. So there were clients who didn't answer, or clients in subjects who didn't answer all the questions. While the whole inquiry was made, or took quite long, from January till August 2021, because it takes a lot of time, and of course you have also some other things to do over that time. So it took quite long, and I had relatively short time to prepare results into the final form. So this is the form of research. And next slide, please. The questions asked were seven questions which were closed-ended. That means you had to answer either by yes or no, or you had defined answers, how you perform various things. But also additional comments were welcome, and it was really precious that I received also some comments, because depending on this, I also changed some results, or maybe some results were modified a little bit. But as for the inquired subjects, the results were better in Slovakia, and there was a big problem to get answers from Austria. I don't know the reasons anyway, but this is not the subject of the research. Next slide, please. The first question was necessary, and because it was the presumption of the whole research: did you organize an event with foreign partners? Ever organize an event with foreign partners without interpretation? The overall number was 58, so maybe I expected even a fewer number, or even smaller number than 8. But this question was fundamental, was not so important, but still, to get a general picture of the subjects inquired, I had to ask this question. Next slide, please. And if yes, if you really did not invite, did you know he wouldn't be needed? Yes, so still 16 out of 56 said that he wasn't needed. Yes, so still they weren't sure, but still they didn't order. So this procedure is quite strange, because when I'm not sure, then I really order an interpreter, and I don't say no, I don't need any. So that may result in a disaster anyway. But okay, let's move to the next one. And the third one, which is also a question that was necessary, but I think the answer was more or less clear. Did you manage to hire an interpreter, or didn't you hire or invite the interpreter intentionally? Of course, it was no problem. It is no problem to hire an interpreter. Maybe it is a problem to hire an interpreter for a special field, for a special occasion, but that was more or less clear. But I had to ask this question. The next one, and the next ones are more interesting. What did you do when there was no interpreter? So this is a fundamental question I already indicated earlier. First, the most preferred solution is speaking a third language. This has to do, this result has to do maybe with the prevalence of Slovak subjects which are answered compared to the German ones. That means speaking a third language, they chose to speak, for example, or they chose English as a common communication language, which is perhaps more fair for all participants. Which, I don't know, it made about nearly more than 2/3. Yes, I didn't have the percentages, but it's more than 2/3. On the opposite, the Austrian participants, the number of which I do not indicate because that was not important in our research, chose rather speaking the language of a foreign partner. But well, this also relies to the Slovaks, because the Slovaks rather tended to propose either English or German, because German is a more widely spoken language, of course, and Slovak is a bigger language, and of course Austrians maybe they don't speak so much Slovak as Slovak speaking German. Yes, so for them there's no big it's not a big decision whether to speak German or speak English. Yes, and speaking the other language, that's of course negligible. The two participants. Next slide, please. Have you been satisfied with an event without interpretation? Well, didn't receive any comment, but that may coincide with slide 3, where they decided not to hire, but still weren't sure whether they need it, and there the result may be the dissatisfaction with the event without interpretation, but most of them were satisfied. Yes. Next one. What are the benefits of an absent interpreter? This is also an important question, and as you see, the sum on the whole doesn't make 58 on total, because several answers were possible. Yes, although the questions were close-ended, but several answers are possible. And here we see that money decide. Yes, no additional costs. So money make it, and although quality is important, but the second reason was even not prolonged by interpretation. Yes. That may be disturbing for some people if they are being interpreted. It may be boring when, for example, mainly in partner meetings concerning long-time projects, some partners speak very long, and an interpreter has to interpret it very long. It's normally the turns in which are where the turns are quite short when interpreting consecutively in these project meetings, and so this is a disturbing factor when the whole event and maybe is prolonged by a long consecutive interpretation, and therefore some partners, if they can make themselves understood, really prefer a shorter meeting without an interpreter. No, no other benefits were not mentioned, but I think that money is quite decisive, and the other one is time. But time is money, and vice versa, and so that may have been the decisive factors. Next one. Yes. I got some verbal comments to question 6, which I can translate here. When the interpreter, or only for small meetings, I choose not to call an interpreter. I interpret it myself. Otherwise, I organize everything with the interpreter, and I work with all the partners. Or the interpreter wasn't necessary. Or all participants communicated in English, but sometimes it may happen that the point is lost. This is also a case which I want to point out later in my comments. And last time we can make ourselves understood, each other understood also without an interpreter. Yes, but I want to return to this last but one point later. Next one. Comments from Austrian participants. Often we save time and costs when choosing hybrid events, for example, when it's online or interpreters are online. And we choose not to use an interpreter when direct communication is possible, and so on. The organization effort, flexibility is better, and there's additional effort or additional burden organizing an interpreter. And if you have small meetings, they are organized only a few days in advance, and sometimes we don't get an interpreter. So these are only short comments, but which may have influence on some results, and I want to return to it later, or in quite a few moments. Next slide. So, is interpretation necessary for participants speak a common language, or at least in part? It depends, of course. It depends on the topic complexity, but often there may be problems, and often the interpreter is also makes or is a psychological effect, or presents a psychological effect. I can add my own experience when I had to take part in an interpreting assignment, and the organizer told me the bedtime. So in the afternoon, and told me an afternoon time, and in the morning I learned that I had to be there. And I couldn't be there because I was badly informed the day before. And when I arrived, I don't know, 15 minutes later, after the start of the meeting, there was more or less chaos. So there were small groups forming and discussing. So the interpreter is also a more or less uniting factor, even to everybody who speaks all the languages. It's really a psychological effect. Please return to the presentation. I don't know, the presentation was lost here. Next one, please. Yes, findings. Well, as for the findings or results, the number of replies is satisfactory, but it cannot be objective. Although it said that if you reach a number of 50, then or 50, I don't know, participants or of a research, then if the number is higher, the results don't change so much. But I'm not sure. Events without interpretation are on the rise, but it's not detrimental, I think, to the incomes of the interpreters or to the interpreters as such. It depends on circumstances or individual participants. And in events without interpretation, the language spoken, the communication language, that is the rule that the bigger language overrides the smaller one. Yes, German over Slovak, and English over German, of course, in meetings between, for example, Slovak and Austrian partners. So, and I can say that there's a general satisfaction with no interpretation if it's intended, if it's really chosen, and if all the participants agree, okay, we don't need anybody. But that's only a general feeling, which is a result of this research. It's really not objective. Next one. And so we have the answers, or possible answers to questions. How does the absence of interpreter affect the outcome of the meeting? There's no apparent effect. Yes, that refers to question number 3, intentional hiring. So we can, as interpreters, the interpreters can be satisfied. What are the most frequent solutions if no interpreting is used? That's either lingua franca, English, or which is a common language to all, or German. And how does it affect interpreters? And here we come to the point. The quality is good, but price is better. And this brings me back to question 6, because often it happens that, not often, but always, if there are long-time cooperation projects, first there must be tenders for selecting services, not only catering services, but also interpretation services. And in these tenders, number 1 is price. Yes. Outstanding interpreters, which are used in preliminary talks before the project is launched, are beaten by the low prices of unexperienced interpreters or agencies, and then somebody arrives, the partners do not know, and this is a really topical problem. But this is a thing only the market can resolve, and other rules should be applied in the tenders, in the tenders or tender legislation. Next one. So, if you sum it up, the language skills of clients rise, but it's not detrimental, or it doesn't have a bad effect on the interpreters or the jobs of interpreters. That means the market is changing but not shrinking. Yes, but still we need more data. We need more data. So we see whether we get or we will make another research. Hard to say whether we will have time, but as I said, quality is not enough, and that applies to the market, and something should be done. This is about legislation, and there are aspects where not only interpreters have to do something about it. So these are the general results. It was really a very empirical study, not very scientific one, but I hope you heard some new results. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Děkujem pěkně. Jaroslav, když dovolíte, budu mluvit česky, protože si myslím, že právě díky vašemu vystoupení je jasné, že tlumočení je potřeba a že by účastníci neměli hovořit třetím jazykem, když ho ne zcela dobře ovládají, což je můj případ, protože angličtina není můj pracovní jazyk a myslím si, že tlumočení do angličtiny funguje.
Allow me to thank you very much, and also allow me to switch to Czech language, because we have just discussed the situation when people are not using the language that they speak the best, and I think that interpreters should lead by example. So that is the reason why I chose Czech instead of English, which is not my main language of work.
A já tímto děkuji kolegovi Pavlovi Švedovi, že tlumočí do angličtiny. Děkuji za zajímavý projekt, který jste tady představil, a já bych se dovolila mít nějaké otázky k těm výsledkům, jestli mohu. Vy jste říkal, že jste měl 7 otázek.
Ano, přesně tak. Slyšíte?
Ano, slyšíme, ale já budu ještě pokračovat tedy ve svých otázkách.
Ano.
Vy jste říkal, že jste ten svůj výzkum dělal mezi lednem a srpnem letošního roku. Já předpokládám, nebo tedy myslím si, že většina podniků nebo těch různých veřejných institucí, sdružení a podobně fungovaly v online režimu. Takže by možná bývalo zajímavé také položit otázku, zda třeba ty jejich setkání nebyly online a jestli třeba přes Zoom, jako to teď děláme my, nebylo možné toho tlumočníka zapojit. Takže, protože jsem viděla, že tam zmiňujete u Rakouska, že některé ty události byly hybridní. Možná by bývalo zajímavé explicitně se zeptat, zda tedy takovýchto hybridních nebo tedy online zasedání bylo v té době vlastně lockdownu nebo koronaviru více. Takže se ptám, jestli třeba jste neměl více komentářů na tuto problematiku.
To sice ne, to jsou všechny komentáře, které jsem dostal, ale je pravda. Možná bych to zařadil ještě do nějakého dalšího průzkumu, ale určitě ano, já sám jsem tlumočil na vícero takovýchhle akcích, kde bylo nutné, které byly hybridní, různé kurzy například, nejenom teda přednášky, ale kurzy, kde pro účastníky, například to byl účastník, to byl kurz průvodců Národním parkem, jo? Takže to byla celá řada přednášek, kterou jsem tlumočil, takže určitě ano.
dodat, že pro účastníky, kteří jsou připojeni online, si mohou zapnout aplikaci tlumočení na Zoomu a slyší tlumočení do angličtiny od kolegyň zde v kabině v sále. Takže tímto děkuji kolegovi Pavlovi Švedovi, že tedy vlastně nemusí. Měla bych ještě další otázku a vychází tak trošku tedy z mé zkušenosti. Jak vidíte, i na obrazovce jsem už trošku starší generace. Jestli jste třeba se nezajímal o to, kdo jsou ti vaši respondenti a jestli třeba ta absence nebo požadavek na nenutnost mít tlumočníka vyplývala třeba i z věkové struktury, protože čím starší, jak si účastníci, tím asi by více preferovali možná toho tlumočníka. Takže bývala bych třeba eventuálně zkusila tu otázku obrátit. Vy jste se ptal, what are the benefits of an absent interpreter. Já bych se třeba spíše zeptala, what are the benefit of the present interpreter, jaké jsou tedy plusy toho, že tlumočník je přítomen. Víme všichni, protože jsme vyučující tlumočení, že neustále vysvětlujeme nejenom tedy klientům, ale studentům, že tlumočník je potřeba a že je to vlastně někdy výhoda pro toho účastníka. Jednak může svést problémy na tlumočníka, říci, bylo to špatně přetlumočeno, tak jsem to nechtěl. Říci, jednak má třeba víc času na to, aby si rozmyslel, co chce odpovědět. Takže vy jste i sám v těch komentářích právě ukazoval, že tam někdo píše, že je výhodné mít tlumočníka, takže by bylo třeba zajímavé do budoucna rozšířit to a zeptat se naopak pozitivně, jaké jsou výhody tlumočníka.
Ja budem pokračovať možno po slovensky, pretože to bude lepšie možno pre tlmočenie, ale teraz mi to nejako väzbí. Normálne sa počujem a toto je momentík, ja si spojím slúchadla. Takže, aby som sa k tomu vrátil, je to pravda. Ja som sa snažil aj tak v tom prieskume osloviť tých hráčov na trhu, ktorých poznám z mojej tlmočníckej praxe. To znamená, že sú to často napríklad krajské úrady, ktoré sú partnermi v cezhraničných projektoch. Sú to ľudia vlastne, musím povedať, že ktorých aj osobne poznám, ale ktorým som netlmočil nejakú dobu, ale viem teda, že realizujú cezhraničné projekty alebo bývalí zákazníci, o ktorých viem a ktorí už napríklad nepotrebujú toľko tlmočenie, alebo zákazníci mojich kolegov. Áno, ale čo sa týka tých projektov cezhraničnej spolupráce, tam poznám veľmi veľa ľudí a poznám aj samozrejme ich vek a tak ďalej a všetko sú to ľudia, ktorí majú veľmi dobré jazykové kompetencie, z časti teda sú to Slováci napríklad, ktorí sa vysťahovali do Rakúska a ovládajú nemčinu ako perfektne, aj angličtinu, takže tam to nie je žiaden problém, ale skôr ja som nazval tú moju tému tak preto, lebo som to bral ako niečo zvláštne, teda, že naozaj je to fakt teda, že často ten tlmočník nie je prítomný a čo z toho vyplýva. Ale samozrejme, ale samozrejme, dá sa to aj obrátiť. To je jasné, že ja som na strane tlmočníkov, to je jasné, že tá prítomnosť tlmočníka je určite kľúčová, absolútne. Takže s vami naozaj hlboko súhlasím. Len som to chcel obrátiť, teda, že ak už, tak teda prečo? Takže niečo v tom zmysle. A myslím si, že v rámci tých hráčov, ktorí sú tam oslovil na trhu, vlastne tých aktérov, tak som oslovil väčšinu, ktorú som dokázal. Akože, ano, oveľa viac ich tam nie, ale môžu vždy byť ďalší. Neviem, Burgenland, to je tiež ako napríklad Dolné Rakúsko, aj tam je veľa hráčov, ktorých by som mohol ešte osloviť, dalo by sa to, vždy sa to dá rozšíriť a skvalitniť. Či už kvantitatívne, alebo aj kvalitatívne, no.
Samozřejmě, děkuji strašně moc. Já naprosto chápu, že jste to zvolili jakožto absence, tedy nepřítomnost tlumočníka, takže to byly jenom moje takové drobné komentáře. Ale už tady mám kolegu Pavla Švedu, který by se také chtěl na něco zeptat.
Zdravím ťa, Jaro. Mám na takú jednu otázku k tvojmu výskumu. Čau. A chcem sa spýtať vlastne na takú tú optiku pohľadu na tých zákazníkov, lebo ty sa pýtaš vlastne klientov, že ako hodnotili podujatia bez tlmočenia, ale vlastne nevieme, aká je ich minulá skúsenosť s tlmočením, lebo je celkom iné, ako sa na tlmočenie pozerá niekto, kto nikdy tlmočníka nepoužíval a vlastne celý čas organizuje podujatia svojpomocne, a ako by sa na tlmočníka pozeral niekto, kto už zažil podujatie s dobrým tlmočením a napriek tomu sa napríklad rozhodol si ho v budúcnosti neobjednať. Čiže ako o mnoho zaujímavejšie bolo by poznať vlastne tú logiku uvažovania z pohľadu zákazníkov, či už nejakú skúsenosť s tlmočením mali, alebo nemali. A podľa toho by bolo zaujímavé rozkategorizovať, lebo ak sa rozhodli neobjednávať tlmočenie napriek tomu, že už ho niekedy zažili, tam by boli tie odpovede veľmi validné, lebo vedeli by si urobiť názor na to, že prečo to tlmočenie nechcú, alebo prečo si ho neobjednali. Ale človek, ktorý nikdy to tlmočenie neochutnal, keď tak to poviem, nemôže vlastne vedieť objektívne posúdiť výhody a nevýhody produktu, ktorý nepoužíva.
Rozumiem. A teraz začnem z opačného konca. Poznám prípad jedného nemenovaného pána, veľvyslanca, a to bolo zaujímavé, ktorý mal napríklad zlé skúsenosti s tlmočením a normálne si tlmočil sám. To znamená, že bol na nejakom stretnutí a teraz povedal niečo po slovensky a teraz, že povedal som a tak ďalej, normálne v prvej osobe a povedal to po nemecky. Takže potom zmenil názor teda neskôr s inými tlmočníkmi, ale bohužiaľ toto bola takáto negatívna skúsenosť, že ten naozaj sa stretol s nejakými nekompetentnými tlmočníkmi, ale je pravda teda, že ten trh je naozaj rôzny. No tuto v prípade týchto cezhraničných projektov je to tak, že tam už z hľadiska právneho, alebo neviem, ale z principiálneho, keďže ide o cezhraničný projekt, tam vždy teda sa vychádzalo základný predpoklad, musí byť tlmočník, pretože ja neviem, tie projekty už bežia naozaj 20 rokov, alebo teda minimálne tých 17 od vstupu Slovenska do Európskej únie, kedy aj Slovensko môže čerpať európske fondy. Takže odvtedy vlastne to začalo mať pre slovenské regióny, obce a tak ďalej zmysel, až po tie najmenšie, kde sú vlastne participujú starostovia, členovia obecných rád, ale aj niektorí experti v mestských častiach, alebo čo, ktorí zase sú jazykovo celkom zdatní, áno, ale presnú históriu neviem, ale určite tam ten tlmočník jednoducho bol predpísaný a týmto haslo.
Děkujeme za odpověď a tady máme další dotaz od kolegy Martina Ďovčuče, prosím.
Dobrý deň, pán docent, tak aby ste ma videli, tak ja som prišiel dopredu. Ďakujem vám veľmi pekne za otázku. Ja by som sa chcel opýtať, lebo vy ste sa tam pýtali na ten časový faktor, že niektorým z tých klientov prekáža, že im to zabera veľa času, ale predsa pri simultánnom tlmočení to nezabera žiaden čas. Že či ste tam sa pozreli na rozdiel medzi konzekutívnym a simultánnym a v podstate v prípade online tlmočenia na Zoome ten náklad sa radikálne minimalizuje. To znamená, že nemajú tam náklady na dopravu, nemajú náklady na stravu. Takže de facto by to bolo úplne jednoduché, lebo dobre, máme zložité systémy ako Kudo, Kvakva a tak ďalej, drahé, ale Zoom naozaj nie je drahý. Hej? Že či práve sa to nezjednodušilo teraz? To by som sa chcel spýtať. Ďakujem.
Áno, ešte sa ospravedlním teda, že mi nefunguje kamera, čo ma veľmi ruší, teda, že ma nemôžete vidieť. A trošičku to zhoršuje ten celkový dojem. Určite áno, na to som myslel už na začiatku a týkalo sa to napríklad online školení, ale napriek tomu v tej korporátnej oblasti a najmä v oblasti tých cezhraničných projektov tá simultánka, ja neviem, to robí možno nejakých menej ako 10% tých akcií. Napríklad v tej projektovej spolupráci to je všetko konzekutíva. Takže to som trošičku aj vzal do úvahy, že to tam má dosť veľký vplyv. Simultánne tlmočenie sa tam používa napríklad na úvodné podujatie projektu, na záverečné podujatie, kde príde viacero hostí a tak ďalej. Tam sa prezentujú tie hlavné ciele a potom tie hlavné závery projektu a to je veľká akcia a tak, to je pravda. Ale to sú možno z nejakých 50 tlmočení 2 alebo 3 akcie. Takže kvôli tomu som to tam...
Takže děkujeme moc krát. Já myslím, že už žádné další otázky nejsou tady v sále ani z online prostoru, takže pane docente, moc a moc děkujeme za vaši prezentaci, za tento výzkum, který zcela určitě, jak jsem pochopila, a my všichni tady v sále bude pokračovat, takže přejeme hodně štěstí v dalším návazném výzkumu a těšíme se a jestli se nemýlím, tak ve 13 hodin po obědové pauze pokračujeme panelovou diskusí. Takže zatím dobrou chuť a nashledanou.
Děkuji pěkně, paní profesorko, a doufám, že se tak ještě osobně někdy setkáme, poněvadž já jsem se chystal přijít a bohužel, ne, že bohužel tedy, ale bylo mi doporučeno zůstat doma, no, což je ty sice lacinější, ale není zas osobní kontakt.
Já myslím, že ještě není všem dům konec a že se uvidíme. Takže zatím nashledanou a všem také.
Nashledanou. Paní profesorko, dobrou chuť.